All right. So today's dialogue, we're going to talk about growth as a creative professional, which I think is interesting because I think all of us probably, I mean, we are creative professionals, although Ross doesn't usually call himself that. Um, but we are technically, right? We create things for a living, even if they're not traditional art, works of art or anything. And so I think, naturally we kind of have a bent towards needing to continuously upskill, right? We're always having to learn new things, new approaches, new ways of creating, and new ways of managing our own personal development. I would say add to that the fact that we're all remote now. It's not like we have these like very specific, like once a week, we're going to meet in the conference room and we're going to do a training on X, right? Like we do trainings online, but it is a little bit different probably. And so, yeah. So today I just want to dialogue about growth as a creative professional. So let's just kind of start at like the very basic, like define terms, all get on the same page about what we're talking about. What is personal growth? Is personal growth separate from professional growth? Is it not? What's your perspective on that?
I mean, I definitely think they're intertwined, but I do think they are two distinct, places to be. I think my personal growth accentuates my professional growth.
Mm-hmm.
So I think one maybe contributes more to the other. I don't know that my professional growth necessarily upskills my personal growth. I kind of see it the other way. But yeah, it's just, I think personal growth for me is in a way like dialing back from what I do every day and finding a place where I want to learn more in a way that's like very specific to me. Right? Like in a professional setting, I learn things that are beneficial to the professional setting. I learn things that, make me better at my job or make me a better communicator or all of those things. But personal growth for me is like, I know it's going to make me a happier person. I know it's going to make me a better person. And that's where I see that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think I'd agree with that. Your personal growth definitely contributes more to your professional growth than vice versa, I think. Um, I feel like professional growth is maybe like more skills based, so I want to learn how to do X or Y, whereas personal growth is more kind of the softer skills and, maybe more around communication and, just kind of things that bridge both your personal and professional life.
Yeah, the professional seems to be more, I guess in my case, more specific, right? I want to learn an ancillary skill that will, be beneficial in this area of my business. Where I guess from a personal growth standpoint, I don't know. There are times that my personal growth has no intrinsic value to anybody else, right? It's not bringing anything to the table other than it makes me happy. It makes me a better person, right? Something along those lines. And I do agree, it does bleed into your professional. But I would say that I see it the other way as well. One of the things that, it's weird, right? We're talking about skills, but at the same time, one of the biggest things from a professional growth standpoint that I've ever been able to accomplish as a people pleaser is the ability to say no. And right, and say no, I won't take on this project, or no, that's outside of my skill set, or no, it just doesn't work for me. As opposed to and in my personal life, I've seen once I was able to do that in business, I was able to actually do it in my personal life as well. It didn't come from that specific place in my personal growth. And maybe the two are very similarly intertwined, but I think that there is a bit of back and forth. But I think that the skills side of it is very, very specific on the business and in the business world. So.
Yeah, I think I tend to blend the two a lot. And I don't know if it's because I'm an entrepreneur and just like the lines between my professional and personal life are virtually non-existent. And most of what I do for a living is related to leadership, relating to people. Like that's most of my job, right? Either as a consultant or as like the owner of HireWriter. So for me, like the skills that it takes to do that are very similar. Like the skills that it takes for me to relate to all of you guys with all your different personalities and all your different penchants and all your different communication styles and all that are very similar things that I would like apply to like learning my children and learning how to communicate with them, because it's like they're also foreign objects and think differently than I do. And I have to navigate an understanding. not to oversimplify it, but I don't know. I feel like there is definitely a reciprocity for me between building those two things. But then there's like the hard work of like, healing your inner child that probably doesn't have a lot of like direct correlation to your like productivity, but it may have an indirect one, right? Like getting healthy is getting healthy and being better at everything you do. But at the end of the day, I think personal growth is all work, regardless of if it's personal or professional.
Absolutely.
I would classify it as work.
And honestly, personal growth is much harder than professional growth, I think, because professional growth for me often has a very linear path, right? I want to accomplish A, B, C, D, E, whatever. But with personal growth, it's like, ooh, I recognize something about myself that's maybe not so great. And I want to maybe dig into that a little further. And it's less linear. It's way more work and way more difficult.
It seems like it's much broader topics too, right? Like, I want to be a better person. How can I do that? And there are a million different avenues to go down that route. Whereas I want to learn Spanish because I want to be able to speak with clients. That's a very specific and hyper-focused piece. So I think it's very different in that regard. But at the same time, I don't know that personal growth has to have, you mentioned the productivity side of it. To me, personal growth doesn't have to have any type of productivity related aspect. It can just be even on the business side of things. If it just makes me a little bit more efficient, then that's fine. If it doesn't, then that's fine too. If it just makes me, cognizant of something that I wasn't aware of before, I think it has its own intrinsic value in that way.
Yeah, I think with professional growth, I agree with Caitlin. It's more kind of linear and mapped out. You can, see like 3, 4, 5 steps ahead of you and say, okay, in 5 years, I want to be in this kind of job, doing this kind of work with this kind of responsibilities. Personal growth, it's kind of harder to, there's no real path for you to refer to. And, there's less kind of almost like measurable kind of, things that you can wrap around it and say, okay, in, 5 years, I want to be this type of person, right? It's much more loose than, professional goals that you might have or skills that you want to develop professionally. So, it can be difficult to wrap your arms around what you want to improve. And, that might cause you to get kind of like stuck in the mud when it comes to personal growth because you don't really know, where to go or what resources you need to seek out. Whereas for professional, it's much more clear, I think.
Yeah, it's about, kind of to your point, Ross, it's the journey. It's not the goal, right? Is ultimately what it boils down to. And I think
you have to choose personal growth. That's something you have to choose to do. I mean, professional growth, you can be pushed into that. You could have a job that says you need to learn X, Y, Z, and you go and do that because you want to keep your job. At the very like basic level of it, you have to do these things to perform. Whereas personal growth, you have to identify that there's some area for you to enhance or some area for you to grow in. And if you are uninterested in that, you can remain yourself and not grow personally for your entire life. You could just be stagnant to your own detriment, I think, because I think there's personal growth space for everybody. But professional growth, I think it's a little more orchestrated, maybe a little less of your own control. There might be external factors that can force that along.
Yeah, I think if you surround yourself with the right people, though, they can kind of push that personal growth in you a little bit as well.
Sure.
So, like, I don't think there's like no kind of, driving force for personal growth outside of yourself. Like, your spouse, your like best friends, your family, like they can all push you to be better people or, want to be a better person. Maybe is, how it is instead. So yeah, but I think that's, that comes back to your relationships and surrounding yourself with the right people, which is part of personal growth.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, but it's interesting you mentioned the family aspect of it because there are definitely catalysts to personal growth, in my opinion, right? I know for me, I was a college dropout and going back and finishing my degree did not happen until our son was born. And so that was a personal choice for me to say, I have to do this. And this is something for my family. And so you're right in that regard, but it wouldn't have happened or may not have happened at all without that kind of kickstarting it. And I think that we see that throughout our lives where you have these weird things that happen, things that come up, and it's like, okay, well, to Caitlin's point, you catch something that stands out as, oh, maybe I'm doing this wrong, or maybe I'm not looking at it in the right perspective and I need to grow. And I think that it also takes a level of maturity to do that. It's hard to do that whenever you're younger. It's hard to do it. And you don't see the forest for the trees in many ways. And I think that once you start maturing, I think that becomes and it becomes easier to do in business as well in your personal life. As you get a little bit older, I think.
I think when it comes to kind of a business context, like I've been reflecting on what you guys said, or as far as like, the goal of personal growth is being happy. I mean, I think we are standing in a sea of change, right? Like if we look at, and because I was going to ask the question, like, can you be a terrible, unhappy person and be successful in business? Like the question is totally yes. But that when we say totally yes, the people we're thinking of are people who are probably at least a decade older than us, who are the grumpy, grouchy, right? I mean, they're the
Yeah,
silent generation,
absolutely.
the boomers, and that's not I mean, that's wildly generalization, but nevertheless, right? That's the people who come to mind. And so I almost wonder if like the business climate is changing so much that technical skills are not necessary. Like they may be what get you a job, but they're not what advance you. I mean, in my own context, I mean, I have degrees in philosophy. Like I am not technically qualified to do a lot of the things I've done in my career, but I have the confidence and the personality to have gotten into certain fields and then upskilled a lot. But what got me in the door wasn't necessarily my technical qualifications, it was my personality, right? So I don't know. Like I almost wonder if the tides are changing so much that, you think about rising talent, you think about, people who are okay, like Mason's age now, and then maybe a decade above him. Like what are they going to value in a boss, in a leader? Who are they going to trust? What's going to typify the typical business environment? And will people who are fundamentally, functionally unhappy and ruthless and all of that, like, is that actually what's going to be successful? Maybe it
Well,
is now, but not in the future, maybe.
I mean, when we're going through, to your point, it's kind of a sea of change. We're going through how we redefine success
Mhm.
in general, right? That's, it used to be a house and a white picket fence and a 9 to 5 job that you absolutely hated and everything else, but you had these specific things. Now that's not the thing, right? I mean, for my son, it was, for years it's been, I want to live in a van and travel and do adventure photography and things like that. And obviously, as you're younger, those type of you have those really really wild dreams, and I think that's great to be able to chase them 100%. But I think that but success doesn't look the same as it did even whenever I was going to in high school, because for me the only path to success and personal growth, if you will, kind of back on topic, was to go to college. That was the only avenue. That was the only thing that was ever thrown at me. Whereas I think that from an educational standpoint, we're seeing a lot of different things come out where it's like, hey, we want to give you the opportunity to try things, to become a more well-rounded person, and have the opportunity to kind of dip your toe in the water of all these things and figure out what you want out of life. And that is their, basically they're kickstarting personal growth journeys at a very early age. Now, where I don't think it was ever really talked about whenever I was a kid.
Yeah, the paths are entirely different. I think, that generalized grumpy top of the business kind of person that we're envisioning, that the way they got there and the way that we are going to be in those seats someday, completely like night and day different. And yeah, what you both have said, like our interests and the way that we're checking our boxes, so to speak, like is an entirely different thing. We no longer is that rigid path where you go, okay, we have to go to college, we have to get an MBA, we have to do like, XYZ to get to that CEO seat. We don't have to do that. There's so many other paths to success. And even if that final destination is the same thing, even if it is C-suite, even if it is managerial level, like whatever you want to be in, there's the people that are moving into those seats now have a bigger appreciation for the way that our younger generations are going to find themselves there. The value is going to be in, the external experiences that people have had, rather than, oh, I sat in school for this long and I'm totally qualified to be here. And I'm thankful for it.
Yeah.
I mean, you get such bigger ideas, you get such bigger goals and dreams, and things become less rigid, and it just becomes, businesses become passion projects that turn into a professional experience. And I think that's just so beautiful. Like, people become happier because they actually get to see their products or their dreams come to fruition. And it's like, why did past generations, bootstrap it so hard in such a rigid way and then become so grumpy? Like, why did no one say, we don't like this, let's actually just pitch, like, let's just try something different? Why did they just settle in on checking the box for the dream, checking the box for the career, and just being miserable about it? That's a hard pass for me.
Yeah, I think people see that and they're like, for want of a better term, I don't want to do all that BS, right? I don't want to go to college and be like $100,000 in debt, and I don't want to go and sit in a cubicle for 20 years so that I can sit in a corner office one day, right?
Mm-hmm.
I think the world is a lot bigger now. There's more opportunities, so you can kind of, you don't have to do that. There's different paths to success, whereas in the past it might have been more like linear and more rigid, like we talked about, right? But now there's, so many more options. There's so many different ways to be successful and to be happy. And, I agree with Mark. I think like what people regard as success has changed a lot, right? It's not necessarily the house with the white picket fence and the kids and the dog and, all that kind of stuff. I think, there's a lot more flexibility and people feel more empowered to kind of go after whatever it is that makes them happy rather than, whatever they're expected to do to be happy.
I think one of the other things in that same picture is loyalty to businesses is changing, right? People feel less loyal to their employers than they have in the past. So you're not seeing as many people willing to stick it out for 20 years in a job they hate because they don't have to anymore. And this, I don't want to call it a stigma, but yeah, it's really not a stigma, but it's like the way that people feel tied to those businesses, because we're seeing more and more that businesses don't have any loyalty to their employees. We've seen that on mass layoffs. We've seen time and time again, businesses like firing hundreds of people via email, effective immediately. Like, thanks, I've worked here for 15 years, but it's fine. I'll just go find somewhere else to be. Mm-hmm. So I think, that plays a huge part in it too. It's a hard reality check, but
the interesting thing is kind of to Ross's point, the linear side, right? And I look back at, college for me, and I was mountains of student debt. That was the way, right? That was the way. Then that was really the only option. But at the same time, right, like obviously I got value in my education. There's no denying that. And I still use those skills. And I think from a growth standpoint, that was important. But probably more important, kind of to Joy's point, was going into college, I could not speak in front of more than 3 people. I was incredibly shy. Could not do it. I was in this little bubble, and it was just, and it took going to college and being away and being on my own and going through that experience and making friends outside of who I already knew and grew up with and things like that to really pull me out of my shell. And then once that happened, it was probably the bigger catalyst than anything I learned in college from a technical standpoint. And so, from a personal growth standpoint, even if it is a linear path, there's still opportunity for you to find pieces that you can improve upon in your life and things like that. I think that can't be overlooked. I know, like I said, there's no one right path, but at the same time, traditional way of going about it, there's nothing wrong with that if that's what you want. And just being able to find different ways to pull those pieces out. I know, Joy, you look shocked whenever I said that.
I am shocked. I had no idea you were shy then. You got an afro, you're shy. Like, come on.
Now, my salutatorian speech, and you have to remember, I was in a class of 15 people. My salutatorian speech lasted 30 seconds long because I could not muster anything more than that, and then I shuffled off stage.
You've come a long way. I'm shocked.
I've come a very long way. Yeah.
I hate the term growth mindset, although I love Carol Dweck, but I think, growth mindset has become like a byword and people talk about it all the time. But I do think, and, Stacy and I talk about this a lot, where it's like one of the key traits that we look for in people that we want to be on our team is essentially a growth mindset, right? Like, I think there are certain kinds of people who are focused on and committed to their own growth. Like, they're just innately curious. They're self-motivated. Like, some people are just either wired or have become that way, and other people are not that way. And I have absolutely seen that I can create this environment. And you know me, like, I'm all about, like, I will teach you anything you want to know about the way I think, and you can come watch me, and you can ask any questions. Like, I'm very passionate about like creating a community where we're learning and growing together. There are people who take me up on it and people who just never do. And they don't change and they don't grow. So it's like I can create this. So in the same environment, two different types of people, one will grow and one will stagnate. And so I think that there is an element of maybe even stepping back from the idea of separation between personal and professional growth and literally just thinking about growth as a way of living, right? Change as a way of living. I mean, neuroscientists talk about how like you get the 30-year bump, right? Like when you hit your early 30s, your brain like starts to hardwire and settle into patterns. And unless you are super intentional about breaking out of those patterns and doing new things, you really become stuck, right? We wear the same clothes that we stop trying new styles of clothes because for Pete's sake, we've been through enough iterations of this, right? You really do. And I've even witnessed it in myself where I'm like, I don't want to go to a different workout class. I've gone to them all. Can't I just do step aerobics? Like you just get in these patterns and you're like, this is my comfort zone. This is familiar. And your brain is always going to default to what's easy. So I think even more than like, do you apply growth practices to your life? It's like, do you view yourself as somebody who is meant to grow and then seek out growth opportunities?
I mean, I think I don't know. One thing that struck a chord with kind of what you were saying is you're talking about the team dynamic, and some are growing, some are not. I wonder, is that a fair comparison? Because we know that people grow on different timelines, right?
Hot take.
Not everybody grows at the same rate. We can't all keep up with you, Joy. Like that is we know that for a fact. But at the same time, right? Expecting, and I think that's something that we fall into. It's hard as you get older, right? Obviously, I'm approaching 40, so as I've gotten older, it's one of those where I look at my son and his growth, and I expect him to be at these certain milestones, but I also have to realize that he's not me. He's not going to have the same passions as me. He's not going to have the same drive as me. He may have more drive than me. It could be completely different, but at the same time, and I think from a that's a personal growth thing on my part as well, is just accepting that not everybody's on the same timeline. If you're 50 and you're growing, great. If you're 50 and you're growing very slowly, great. As long as you are growing is the main thing.
That is I received that. That's a very good perspective. Thank you for saying that.
You're welcome.
I needed to hear that.
I read years ago that change is the only constant. And I have no idea where I read that, but it was while I was in college. And in college, you're trying to figure out like who you are and where you want to go. And I can tell you like with 100% certainty that I am nowhere near where I thought I would be. When they tell you to do your time capsule and what are you going to be in 10 years? Yeah, that's not where I am right now. Not even remotely close. And I don't hate it. I'm not upset about it, but it's just, I remember reading that thinking, okay, I can have all these firm plans. And at the end of the day, could I have gotten what I wanted? Sure. But it would have been at like the detriment of my own self, because all of that change that had to happen that was either forced on me or like, through experiences in the environment or the way that I found my path to be presented as, right? I had this linear plan. And then when I was faced with, whatever the challenge was, I thought, wait a second, I don't actually like this. And that change is the only constant, kept coming back to me and coming back to me. So I can't imagine ever being stuck or wanting to settle for that linear path when change is like always knocking at your door and asking you to iterate, and the world's asking you to iterate, right? And when you sit and just close the door, there's so many things that you could be missing out on. I think that's the saddest thing about change.
Well, not just be missing out on, but get blown by, right? Mm-hmm. We talk about AI in our field all the time, and it's either adapt and overcome, or you're going to get left behind. Mm-hmm. things like that are just inevitable. And it's in it, AI and the technology is improving in every industry and basically every field. So, you have to have some degree of adaptability. And I think that just that's acknowledging that and understanding that is going to be paramount moving forward.
Especially as a creative.
Oh yeah, for sure.
Especially as a creative. I mean,
but-
beyond our field, like you could, plenty of other, roles and responsibilities could sit without change. They could sit by the wayside and do their job and, move on. But as a creative, holy mackerel, if you're not actually changing, you're going to get put behind. You're going to get left in the dust. And it's almost it's like the fire nipping at your heels,
Joy, do you see it from so you mentioned it, you get to see both sides of the equation, right? I mean, we've joked about certain things about, copy that we've seen that's crazy and people apply and it's like, this isn't a fit and things like that. But do you see the growth mindset more in the freelance community maybe than you do the traditional business world? I think I do, but at the same time, I've been in both sides of the, both sides of the equation. But I think I see it more working with teams like HireWriter because we are all more individually minded of, okay, this is the path I'm going with my specific skill set, and it's not being shaped by anybody but ourselves.
Yeah, I think there are definitely people who take initiative, and there is a certain trait of the kind of person who is willing to take risks, to take initiative, who's a little bit more, open-minded about a non-traditional career trajectory. And I think that may be more prevalent in the freelance community, but I also think the freelance community is dying, and I think it will die. But that's a different conversation. What do you think, Russ?
I mean, I think, there's different people everywhere, right? Freelance or business or elsewhere. There's, great freelancers and there's great business people and there's terrible freelancers and there's terrible business people, right? Everyone has different motivations to change. I think, to Mark's point, some of the people in the freelance community probably have a little bit more of that fire underneath them where it's like, okay, you have to, evolve and change or you're going to become irrelevant. Whereas in a business, if you're just kind of, comfortable at your station and not really progressing, but, everything's fine. I think there's a lot more people like that in businesses maybe than the freelance community. I think the other thing I was thinking as well as you guys were kind of talking is, people have different seasons of growth. I think I don't know if it's realistic to expect people to be, totally focused on growth, professional or personal, 100% of the time, all of the time, right? People have, things going on in their life outside of work that kind of detract from their ability to give their full attention to something or, have the mental capacity to embrace different kinds of growth. So I think, that's something that, you probably have to be cognizant of and kind of adjust your expectations for how people are going to grow. Yeah.
You can't judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree. Right.
Yep.
I mean, no, I think you're spot on, Ross. I think that's, I would say that one of the contributing factors to your point is about comfortability, which I was guilty of it too in the corporate world, is you're collecting a paycheck, right? And there are a lot of people that do that, and there's nothing wrong with that. But at the same time, and you'll see the people that have more of a growth mindset that are more focused on personal growth, their career trajectory takes off at a much faster rate, and it's recognizable. People have animosity toward it at sometimes, which is interesting to me. And maybe that's because they're not at that point in their personal growth journey. But I think that, but that's part of it. And I think in the freelance world, it's interesting because I have to be interested in growth because otherwise I'm not going to be able to pay the bills, right? I have to be able to grow my business, and to do that, I have to become better in specific areas, and that's never going to stop. And I recognize that from the day that I started, and I think that that's probably a potential catalyst, kind of to my point earlier. But yeah, it's interesting. It's the corporate world. I don't know. being out of it now for 3 years is I see a lot more than what I recognize a lot more than what I did whenever I was, knee deep in the weeds with it.
So let's talk a little bit about our own kind of growth practices. Ross, what you said really resonated with me about the seasonality of this, because I definitely find myself like going through phases with different kinds of growth. I mean, for me, the one constant is books, because that's how I learn best, is by reading. And so I'm always reading, and I just showed you, like I'm always reading my books, and I've got my studies, right, that I'm doing. But I go through phases with like podcasts or even types of growth that I'm keen on. So I think that may be part of it. It's just accepting the fact that there is a little bit of you just need a variety of input. Sometimes I watch Masterclass every day, and other times I go 3 months without watching it because I'm listening to a podcast instead or whatever. But I feel like there's always some kind of growth practice. And for me, it's in the mornings, it's after school drop off, and it's Wednesday nights, and it's weekends. And I kind of have like set times that I'm usually doing something, reading or watching something that, supports my personal growth. But nobody's holding me to that, and it's not very systematized. It's very interest driven. What about you guys?
I'm exactly the same way. I am maybe a little all over the place when it comes to what I'm trying to absorb, because I'm in this weird stage of life where there's a lot happening, and professional growth and personal growth and the things that I'm interested in beyond, those circles. Yeah, it's all over the place like that. And at any given time, I've got, 7 or 8 different podcasts on the run, books that are sitting on shelves that I'm reading a couple pages here and there. I'm like, oh yeah, that whet the appetite. I can move on to something else now. Yeah, there's Masterclass. There's a lot of things. And it is really interest driven. It's like something could easily pique my interest in a day. And I'm like, okay, well, now I'm obsessed with this. Like, this is what I have to learn about for the next 48 hours.
Mm-hmm.
And everything else goes by the wayside. But I think personal growth is one of those ones that is always the undercurrent.
Mm-hmm.
Professional growth, it maybe is a little more like project based. If I'm working on a new project and I go, oh, I need to actually know more about this topic, or why this works the way it does, or why people respond the way they do, then that's, what directs that professional growth. Because I think at this point, beyond like my MBA program, I don't have any other linear path for professional growth other than what I'm, pulling apart. I think I'm still in the phase of life where I'm drinking everything by a fire hose, like as much as I possibly can consume. And there's Post-it notes everywhere. That's like, oh yeah, this little bit of information was really good. I'm going to keep that. Or a notebook full of notes that, I want to come back to. It's all over the place.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would say it's definitely interest driven. I am not afraid to suck at something. I think that's one of my favorite qualities about myself, is that I will dive headfirst into it, and if I don't know how to do it, that's fine. But I also, probably more than I should, I will abandon things like that, which is part of, like, if I lose interest in it, if I realize that it doesn't have any, especially on the business side, if I lose interest in it and I don't feel that it has value and that it's going to take, I don't see where the ROI is going to come, I'll drop it.
Yeah.
Almost immediately. Whether it's a book, whether it's an audio book, whether it's anything, if I'm not interested, it does not keep my attention very long at all. And whether, and that can be good and bad, I think, at the same time, because I think there's a lot of value in sticking with things and, seeing them through, even if it's something you don't agree with, or you're just like, this isn't really up my alley. But yeah, I mean, my wife refers to me as like the world's greatest hobbyist, because on the personal side, I do all kinds of crazy stuff. Like last year, I learned leather working, and I learned how to do all this stuff, and none of it's very good, and that's fine. But I have a base knowledge, and I can at least talk about it, and I can carry on conversations. I brewed beer for 3 months, and it was awful, and it was not good, and I never got it good outside of having a kit and things like that. But I gave it a shot.
Mm-hmm.
Because I felt that it would be something that would just enrich my life, and it would help on my personal growth track. So, but Yeah, and Mason, and it's funny. My son's the same way, like 100%. If he loses interest, he's done with it. He's on to the next thing. So
Now, did you ever see anything like that from your parents? Were your parents hobbyists like that? Because
No.
mine were like hard pass on deviating from anything else. My dad had his job, he had his hobby, and well, two, woodworking and golf, and that's it. That's what he's done his entire life. My mom craft, painted, and worked. That was it. There was no other hobbies beyond that. And so I think out of that nurturing, I fell into an over hobbying kind of space. I'm like, I need everything. I need to be able to touch everything once and figure it out. And if I hate it, then I'll never touch it again. But I need to know for myself that it does not serve me and that it doesn't, in this season of life, like the ROI is not there.
Yep. No, yeah, my dad's like the epitome of a boomer, like 100%. He is that guy. Love him to death, but he is that guy. In fact, he just retired, and he's driving my mom crazy because he doesn't have those hobbies to fall back on. So part of his personal growth is figuring out how to operate in a world post retirement. So
that's fun.
Which is interesting, and I think that it those type of things, and I think that knowing what I do and don't like now will help me later on in life. It may not bring any kind of value now specifically, but 30 years from now, whenever I am sitting around and I don't know what to do, then I at least have some things to fall back on, and I can continue. I think that growth side of it is it prompts that throughout your life if you have it. I don't think it ever stops.
Yeah, I think Joy mentioned earlier about you become hardwired in like your early 30s, and like my dad's in a similar spot to yours where he's about to retire, and everyone's like, "What's this guy going to do with his time? He doesn't really have any hobbies like that. He's into that much in depth, and he just kind of works a lot, and it's like, what are you going to do?" And now it's going to be like a big change. So I think when you're earlier in life, kind of focusing on building the capacity to be interested in that kind of stuff will serve you much better later in life. Definitely agree with that.
Well, what is I regularly see memes that, right, like men, whenever they hit the age of 40, they either get super in depth into World War II history, meats, or woodworking. It's like one of three or four things.
Yeah, one of three, you got a choice.
Right. You just pick one and you just dive in, and it's like, no, there is so much more available, whether it's through like Masterclass or we have stuff through within like Texas residents, right? Through the Houston Library. Anybody that's a Texas resident has access to the equivalent of what is Masterclass. I forget what the name of the program is, but essentially you have all of these different things that you can learn how to do. We are currently learning and polishing our Spanish after we had a debacle in Cancun a couple of years ago, right? So things like that, I think it's interesting, and there are just so many more opportunities than there were 15, 20 years ago, because we have so much more technology at our disposal, and we have the ability to do stuff like this where you couldn't have that type of dialogue outside of the business world prior to that.
Right. So in this same kind of breath, I can't help but wonder if creativity is a use it or lose it skill attribute. I'm not sure how I want to classify that, but do you feel as though if you don't, I look at my dad, right? Since we're on this topic of our boomer parents, I think about my dad, right? So I'm sure at some point he probably had some other hobbies he liked to do, but because of his in the office to the job, sit here and be grumpy in my job, I can't help but wonder if he lost the ability to think creatively and flex that creative muscle. And now in retirement, he's like trying to have to, he's figuring out, how do I make time, or how do I fill my time with things that make me happy? But he may not have that creative muscle to flex. So I wonder, do we lose it if we don't use it?
I think you are what you do, right? And if you don't do something, then eventually that, stops becoming part of who you are. So you can have like lofty ideas about, okay, this is who I am and what I want to be, but unless you actually do it, I think it's kind of hard to become that. And, I think tying it back to like growth mindset, I think that's part of it, right? If you want to grow professionally or personally, you have to actually put in the reps and focus on doing it. I think, that probably applies to creativity as well.
But it's interesting, I keep, hearing everybody talk about their parents. and maybe, and I feel like, this is really, really hard for me to say, but I will say it. I am in, midlife, right? But there is some hypocrisy in the, especially for men, of if you're trying new things, especially as you get older, it's a midlife crisis, right? It's a crisis. It's not an opportunity. And I think that is in and of itself a challenge. And I think that it's something that it will probably die out as the older generations are gone and we start to kind of change the way that we view that type of thing.
Mhm.
But it's something that's very, very real, because if Joy, to your point, if I go change my wardrobe, dear God, what happened? Like it's a,
Are you well?
are you well? Like, oh no, oh, it's fine. He's just going through a midlife crisis, right? Or but it's seen as this negative thing in some connotations. Whereas the truth of the matter is, it could be something where they recognize something they didn't like, and they're completely changing that aspect of their life. So I don't know.
That I think hits on a really good point that I think about a lot, which as a boss, as a mom, as a family member, whatever, is your ability to grow is as much about giving yourself the permission to change as it is being in an environment, like to Ross's point, being surrounded by people who will also give you permission to change. The simplest possible version of a relationship is, here is your fixed identity, here is my fixed identity, and here are the fixed terms of this relationship. And it stays that way, right? Which is the definition of atrophy and death. But it's a lot harder to be like, I know who you are now, and I know that is not who you will always be. And the same is true of me. And we agree that we will continuously communicate so that there is in proximity, we will together grow and change, and continuously hold the terms of this relationship loosely so that we are effectively connected even through seasons of change. Right? It's kind of like marriage, in my opinion, right? Like it's probably the long-term relationship in most of our lives.
To some extent, though, but at the same time, I'm a firm believer that you outgrow relationships, right? I mean, I was very close with all of my friends growing up. I haven't spoken to many of them in 20 years because I outgrew that type of relationship. Now, if I saw them today, it would be, we would have a good time and reminisce and things like that. But even college roommates, I've got a college roommate that has no kids. He's in his his late 30s, and we're very different points in our lives. So whenever we get together, it's very at first when we reconnected, it was very awkward because we had a child, and once I had a child, I had to focus on that, and so I dropped many friendships that were very toxic. And so I think that from a growth standpoint, it's okay to cut ties with people.
Oh yeah,
100%.
Oh yeah.
So,
but I think my bigger point was that my growth is enabled when I'm surrounded by people who give me permission to change.
Yeah. That's fair.
Yeah.
I feel like this is a conversation for another day too. I feel like there's so much to unpack with that.
Mm-hmm.
I suddenly have a lot of feelings.
Well, and it's so hard as a leader because like I want so much to know who you all are and to understand you and to understand that this is not who you will always be. Like both things are true. And I have to give you permission to evolve and grow and not say, I can't stand this about you, and so you got to go. Instead, be like, I can't stand this about you, and we're going to work together to figure out, is it your flaw? Is it my flaw? Is it both? And is there a future for us? Kind of thing, which may sound more intimate than it should. And maybe that's my problem.
But it's a testament to your leadership style. That's not common, right? You look at any think of like the previous employers you've had. I mean, how many of your company leaders or how many of your direct reports like want that for you as an employee? It's not very common. And so I don't know that that's to the detriment of anyone. I think that's honestly such a beautiful thing in an employer's relationship with their employees. Like, that not only builds a better business, it builds a better leader, it builds a better employee. Like you suddenly have a little more skin in the game as an employee when your employer is building you up and pouring into you rather than just, here's your job, do it. Thanks. Here's your paycheck. That to me is tremendously more valuable than even if the paycheck was twice as high somewhere else, like I'd rather be in a place that values me as an employee and the places I could go and the employee that I could be and the human that I could be. That's way more important than anything.
Joy, do you think it's easier or harder with technology? Right? If you were in an office setting, would it be easier to dig into those things and work through them than it is over a virtual environment?
It depends. Last week when we talked, and I think it was 2 weeks ago when we talked about self-expression, we talked about the digital divide a little bit, like the challenge of doing it over a screen. And it was interesting. There were mixed opinions, and Angela was saying that she feels actually that like being across a screen is easier for her because it gives her a filter, to kind of relate to people where it might feel harder. So I don't know. I think it varies, but I think there's my favorite kind of people are the people who are curious. They're curious about life. They're curious about themselves. They're, interested in change and comfortable with change. But I've even had to limit because I am so change and risk tolerant. I have to like closet that a little bit in leadership because it makes people feel very threatened when it's like, okay, well, let's just blow it all up and start over. And I'm like thrilled by that idea. And they're like, my God, So I think growth, there's growth on the personal level, there's growth on the professional level. And then in an ideal way, I feel like the aggregate of those two things would create organizational growth. But I think often that doesn't happen because we grow in private and we're frightened of changing ourselves because it might be received a certain way, things like that.
That probably also closely ties to how people present themselves to an employer, right? Not many people want to bridge the gap between professional and personal. And I mean, personally, I can't stand that. I don't like the idea. Sure, there's things that need to be kept in your own home. Like we don't need to know all the dirty details, but there's a certain amount of like opening up and building relationships that can't be done if you don't try to bridge that gap. And I'm a firm believer that there has to be some sort of, it can't be stonewalled. Mm-hmm. You can't be a person over here and then also be a person over here because one, that's exhausting, and two, that benefits no one. I don't know that saves anybody any trouble.
Mm-hmm.
Hot take.
I agree, but I think it's difficult to create that type of environment if you're a leader because you're asking people to be very vulnerable and you have to, create a lot of trust. And, you can't do that overnight, right? You can't expect someone new to walk into your company and immediately start revealing, like more private kind of parts of themselves. I think it takes months probably for people to be comfortable with that kind of relationship.
And the right leader.
And it takes the right leader. Yeah. 100%.
So Ross, are you that leader?
I think you're that leader.
Okay, well. So Ross, tell us a little bit about, I feel like we didn't quite get your kind of personal and professional approach to growth as somebody we deeply respect. How do you approach that?
Yeah. For me, so I was thinking two things when we were talking about this question. So one is like I focus on things that are practical and, so if it's professional, personal, like things I think will be useful, that will enrich my life, like, less focused on engaging with kind of, more kind of abstract things or skills I don't think I'm going to use. And then the second piece for me is like I learn a lot from like stories. So I like to read like a lot of like memoirs or listen to like podcasts or all that kind of stuff. I feel like, it's much more engaging for me to kind of learn, directly from other people how they've, changed or how they've achieved things than just kind of engage with more like abstract ideas or, like philosophies. Like I like to hear like more tangible examples of how people have applied things for professional and personal growth.
That's fascinating. I like that distinction. I think I'm the exact opposite. I'm not interested in how anybody's ever applied anything. I just want to know the philosophy behind it or the abstract. What do you guys think, Caitlin and Mark? Like, are you more in like principle discovery framework or do you want to see it in the real world?
I don't know that I am either way. I don't know that I have a preference. Ooh.
I know, it's interesting.
No, I want to see the proof,
Okay.
like 100%. But the interesting thing is in all, and even myself, all of our answers were very, they were, it was individualized, right? Not in the sense that we all wanted something different, but it was, there wasn't unless I'm missing something, there wasn't another human component, right? Where it's bouncing ideas off of other people that are, whether it's through stuff like this, or if it's, your spouse, or a friend or a colleague or whatnot. Like, personal growth isn't just limited to your ability to listen to podcasts and read and things like that. It's also just to have open discussions. And those type of conversations can't happen with everybody. I think you do have to have a specific level of trust to be able to do that. But I think that, being in the business, in sales, whenever I was in the sales world, that was one of the nice things about kind of trade shows and things like that, was you were able to connect with people that might have different approaches and different ideas and talk through those, even if you didn't have a deeper level connection with them. But I think that growth comes in that facet as well. It's not just, for me, it's not I can't hole up and just learn. I have to be able to find ways from other people. And I think that's kind of Ross's point, where I need to see it in action as well.
Yeah, and I think that you also want to put it in practice, right? So you don't just want to, I think observing is like the other thing I can say. So like observing like how different leaders operate and what works for them. But I think on top of that, you also have to put it in practice, right? You can't just sit there and, be on the sidelines and watch and read and listen to podcasts forever, right? You have to go out there and figure out for yourself, because what works for someone else isn't necessarily going to work for you. So you kind of have to take that idea or that concept and put your own kind of spin on it, and find a way that kind of works for you to apply to your own life.
Mm-hmm.
You almost have to have I don't know that I would say an aversion to risk, but you have to be somewhat risk tolerant to be willing to grow. Like, you have to be able to put yourself out there, and it's okay to fail, right? And if you're trying something new that you think is going to help you in practice, and it doesn't, that's okay. And I think that especially in the business world, that becomes very, very difficult, because we're all judged on specific metrics and whatnot. And so it's easier to fall back into, okay, well, I know that this works for me, so I'm going to stay in my little bubble, and I'm just going to move forward, rather than I'm going to branch out, just because we are metric driven, unfortunately.
But I think that is such a good point, because what is one of the first symptoms of a toxic culture? It's that nobody tries anything new.
Yep.
Because they're like, either this is going to get shot down, it's going to fail, nobody cares.
Yeah.
I've been humiliated before, it. And that's so hard, because the balance of like setting a standard of excellence and creating an environment where people feel safe to explore feels like dichotomous. So I don't know how to do that.
Can it be done? I don't know.
Guess we'll find out. So what role do other people play in your growth? What a fantastic point to bring up for us.
Yeah, it's funny that Mark mentioned that, being able to
Ross
balance
or Mark,
something-
whoever. Yep.
Oh, sorry.
Both of you, I think, mentioned it.
Well, yeah, that conversation was so good. Being able to bounce it off of different people, because my husband and I do that all the time. He'll hear something cool and he'll be like, hey, did you hear this? And let's have a conversation about it. We have conflicting opinions on a lot of different things. And the beauty of this relationship is that we can bring those things to the table, and I can talk until my face is blue, and he goes, yeah, but, and I'm all ears, because that's the only way. You can pigeonhole yourself in things that you think is right and the way that you think should be done. But unless you've got an interest in competing opinions and are willing to hear those competing opinions, you're never gonna know them. So then, does that stagnate growth? You could be growing, but I would argue that it would stagnate things if you're not willing to listen to what the other side has to say. I love that point, guys. That was really good.
But I think to some degree, right? If somebody else is involved in the equation, right, you have to take it at face value, especially if it's a new concept, a new idea, a new anything that's foreign to you. And then I think you have to be willing to do your own research and come to your own conclusion as well, because, right, we all have different beliefs, we all have different everything. personalities. Not what what works for Ross is not necessarily going to work for me, and that's okay, and I can accept that. But if you're, I do know people that will try just about anything if they hear it, from a growth standpoint, because they're constantly searching, right? I mean, think of it like look at the amount of diet fads that we've had over the course of our lifetimes, right? Everything is the key to success, and people will jump on board with that and they'll dive headfirst into stuff like that, and that's fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But at the same time, what works for one person might not work for the next. I know that's a weird way to frame it, I guess, but
How do you think other people contribute to your growth, Ross? I know you have a good relationship, obviously, with Chris.
I mean, I think you need people who are going to hold you accountable and kind of call you out on stuff, and might not always be like the most positive conversation, but you need someone to keep you in check, right? And think about this idea of you have a personal kitchen cabinet, right? Where you have a small group of people who, you kind of bounce ideas off and, have to hold you accountable and say, okay, you're before you make any major life decisions, oh, should I take this job, or should I move to this town, or should I buy a new house? You kind of bounce it off those people who kind of know you best and have them kind of hold you in. It's kind of like a check and a balance, right? For you to make sure that you're doing the right thing and you're not kind of operating in a selfish way or with the wrong motivations. So I think that is kind of really helpful for me, is just having that kind of group of people who hold you accountable and push you to want to be better, and all that kind of stuff.
I would say, to add to what you're saying, Ross, is I think that the accountability part is interesting. You also have to be willing to accept hearing "I told you so."
That one hurts.
The point that you made, right, is it's interesting, and I think that a lot of great things came from it. But you mentioned moving across the country. I moved to Indiana from Texas with basically on 2 days' notice, and we went and flew up, found a house, moved 2 weeks after that, all during Christmas in 2016. Right, that is chaotic to 100%. We didn't tell our family until we were already in Indiana, but we did. We let them know that we were doing this, but basically it was very, very last minute, and it was because I got a job promotion and they wanted to move me up there. But at the same time, I look back on it and I can admit that probably was not the best course of action to take. Right? There were a lot of great things that came from it, and I probably wouldn't be where I am today without doing that. But at the same time, was it the right way to do it? And should I have seeked guidance in other areas and hey, am I missing something here? Because there were things I was missing, and I can 1000% admit that. But yeah, it's just interesting. Like I said, you have to be able to admit when you're wrong if you choose not to seek that type of guidance.
Yeah, I always joke that the mantra of my entire leadership philosophy could be summed up with I could be wrong. This is what I think is right now, but I could be wrong, right? And that kind of applies to most things in life. And I think it actually is pretty typical of a growth mindset, or being in kind of growth mode all the time. It's insofar with all the information I have, this is what I think is right, but I could be wrong. And I am open-minded with a filter, because I know myself and I know what I think is true. So there's a filter, right? I'm not just open-minded, to your point, Mark, to anything anybody ever tells me to do, because that would be folly. But yeah, this is what I think is right. This is what I think I should do, but I could be wrong, and only time will tell. So we let ourselves grow, we give ourselves permission, and we surround ourselves with people who give us the same permission. I think that's a good recipe for making strides. Any final thoughts on growth as a we didn't really talk about the creative part.
It's such a creative move.
I would say that on the creative side, stepping outside of your comfort zone is definitely beneficial in terms of growth, because we're obviously, from a creative standpoint, right? Writing is my outlet. I feel that I do that well. Like I'm comfortable in that, but I find it interesting to explore other artistic outlets, right? Whether it's, for I don't know, 6 months, and kind of back to my point on hobbyism, it was working with clay, right? Like, hey, I'm not good at it, but I was doing it because it gave me something, and it was for me, it was a different type of learning as well. It was tactile learning. It was not auditory learning, which is what I gravitate toward. So stepping outside of your comfort zone, I think, is a big benefit. Even like I said, don't be afraid to suck at something.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think if you're ever too comfortable, that's like a bit of a warning sign that, you are starting to stagnate. You should always be like at least a little bit uncomfortable with something that's going on. I think that's like a sign of growth.
Yep. What a nice summary. All right. Thanks, guys. My clock just turned.